Voilà. Alors, bonjour ou bonsoir à toutes et à tous. En fait, alors d'abord, je ne sais pas si vous préférez que je parle en français ou en anglais. Are there a lot of German-speaking people around, or? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah, because I asked a question to Daniel Gash, and he told me, well, it's better if you speak in English, probably. So I will do in English. It's not an issue for me. So when I asked also Daniel Gacher whether I should only focus on legal issues related to OSS or be a bit broader than that, he told me, no, be broader than that. I mean, people around, they are not only doing open source. And so I rather will give you kind of a generic presentation, let's say, of kind of specific legal issues arising in IT agreements in general. So as Daniel mentioned, I'm an attorney. IT focusing, but as a disclaimer, I should say I'm usually more on the client side than on the provider one. This being said, it's also an interesting standpoint because it gives you an idea as to what the clients are usually trying to push potentially, especially if they are big players, and what you may want to try and avoid. So just in a nutshell, of course, there are a lot of IT agreements, but I would say if you speak with legal people that are more or less versed in that area, we usually tend to make a distinction between what we call POC, it's a proof of concept, so it's only a test phase basically. Then you have what we call license agreements, so it's an on-premise software that will be set up and installed on your side. And increasingly nowadays, what we focus on, unsurprisingly, is cloud-based software and service. And then you have professional services and digital. So the proof of concept, it's really scope usually limited. Typically, it will run for a couple of weeks. However, if you are in a big multinational company, it can actually go up to a year. And obviously, if it's only for 3 weeks, you will certainly not focus on the contractual aspect. It will be very limited. If it's for a year, obviously it's already another story, and then you tend to think to put a little bit under more scrutiny your contract, at least if you are the client. So the license, I said, although actually in the cloud it's also in the end a license that you grant, but from a terminology standpoint, in the industry, we call a license agreement the one when the software is on site, in opposition to the cloud, which can be an infrastructure platform or software, but usually it's more, I mean, most of the time it's related to a software as a service. And professional, so it's quite broad, but it's all IT that goes around basically the product. So it can be interfacing, it can be consulting, it can be support, training, or even consultancy. All these are professional services that go around the product itself. And digital, so digital agreements are a type of professional, a subcategory of professional services agreement, but the specificity is that they relate to a web, mobile, application development, etc. And this triggers certain issues because usually you subcontract part of the work to an agency, and you will see why usually we handle that as a separate category. So maybe a couple of words with regard to the structuring of IT agreements, because there is a big distinction if you work, as will in most instances be the case, only with one entity, and they ask you to develop something, etc., then it's a bilateral agreement. But if you grow and if you are lucky enough, you may suddenly get the possibility to negotiate with a big company, a Nestle or whatever, and then obviously it's another world and it's another question from a structuring of the agreement. And usually these big companies, they have several ways to potentially do that, but usually what they will ask you is to have a frame agreement where you have the main entity, can be a holding or a procurement company, etc., negotiating the agreement for the account of the whole group at the group level. Usually, you will try to send them your TNC. They will just decline and they will send you their own template and say you need to work on that. And most of the time, you do not have much choice, to be honest. So you need to work on them. And they have two different ways to structure these frame agreements. The frame basically sets the main condition that will define the use of the product. And either it's an enterprise type of agreement that is granted, and then basically they pay a single fee for the whole group, but which triggers for some companies sometimes what is an issue of central liability. Because let's assume you have a frame agreement at a group level within Nestlé, let's say, and that someone messes up with the software in Malaysia. It means that the entity having signed the agreement, for instance, in Switzerland, who may have no clue whatever happened in Malaysia, they are liable potentially towards you as a developer or as a service provider. So some companies, they are fine with that and they accept that. Some do not. And then they say, well, below the frame agreement, you have to sign what is called a transactional document. It can be a statement of work. It can be a purchase order, whatever. And then the affiliate will sign on its own, and this basically takes away the liability from a single entity within a group. And then there are tax issues, etc., etc. But so just for you to know, there are a lot of different ways to structure all these IT agreements. And of course, the more sophisticated your client potentially is, the more you may have to dig into that. So I think one of the main issues in the end for the client and also for the developer is to know, okay, who owns the right and the product in the end that I developed or that I offer. If you are in a license agreement, so there are some specificities. The installation which takes place on premise will usually, will most of the time require an acceptance process. The acceptance might be defined in different ways, obviously. It's related to reps and warranties as well. And typically, I would say, contractually speaking, it is 1 to 3 months of testing phase. And then there is an acceptance where you may have different layers. You may say it's totally accepted. You may say there are some major bugs up to a certain point where you have 1 month to cure, etc., etc. So then it's contractual drafting. And once the acceptance, the product has been accepted, then you go under the warranty. The warranty means that theoretically your product should work in accordance with the specifications. And this also, it depends, but usually the standard is 1 to 3 months of warranty as well. So it's relatively short. But again, it might depend upon your power of leverage. If you are a big company, you may get more than that. But that's, I would say, the standard. The support is different than in cloud-based in the sense that it's not usually part of the license fee. So it's a separate track, a separate contract, and for you, obviously, it's an additional revenue flow, let's say, which is not the case in the cloud-based services agreement. So this means that updates and upgrades normally are not included in the license that you grant to the client, and that if they want to have access to the updates or upgrades, supposedly they need to enter into a maintenance and support agreement. The license can be defined based upon number of metrics. Usually, obviously, it's non-exclusive. Otherwise, you really need to get a premium because you are pretty much giving in your product, which is not the standard business model, at least. So typically, it's a non-exclusive license. It can be, as I mentioned, a single entity, so only for one entity, or enterprise at a group level. The scope, geographical scope of the license, is it only on one market, on several markets, etc., etc.? Triggers obviously question as to the pricing model after as well. The duration of the license is typically limited. but sometimes it can be perpetual, or after a couple of years, the client may say, well, I pay a premium fee, and then my limited license turns into a perpetual license. And then there are use restrictions. So it depends. There can be sometimes no restriction. It can be user-based. The worse for the client being a named user. And then you have concurrent users, obviously, CPU, server, etc. When you know much more than me all the metrics that you can have in terms of use restrictions. I once said in a negotiation the question to know, okay, but is a bot a user of the product? Does it have to pay a fee? The answer was yes, obviously. Unsurprisingly, they say, well, yes, I mean, if you have separate product for the bot, then it's also an additional license. But so you have obviously this type of question which arise, which triggers some question around the definition of user. In the world we are living in, we need to maybe sometimes rethink about that notion. So conversion into perpetual license I have mentioned. One thing as a client, usually that we are always careful at is the price increase control. Because sometimes, I mean, when a provider wants to get a client, you will try and grant an interesting price for the first year, but you think, yeah, but the next year I will basically increase my price maybe by 5%, etc., etc. And the clients, they do not like that. So they will say, yeah, we are not a milking cow. It's not only that you trap us for 1 year and then you try to lock us in and you increase your rates as you want. So they want a price increase control. And they say, well, for a duration of 3 years, etc., it's not, I mean, nowadays it's quite seldom to be more than that because of the market evolving very quickly. But you want over the time for which you contract to have assurance that the price will remain the same. It's part of the negotiation. And you may then discuss upon renewal, potentially, okay, may I increase my rates by 5% or whatever. As a developer, usually, if the license is on-premise, you obviously want to have an audit trail because you want to make sure that the metrics that you have in place are complied with by the client. And some companies, I would say, are making quite a business of audit right now, and and they get quite substantial fees of that. As a client, especially if you are a big company, what you want to try and say, you say, okay, maybe I did not comply with the metrics, but there can be some explanation. It can be temporarily, it's because it's Christmas break and suddenly there is a huge consumption, etc., and especially at different market level. And so we want to make sure that basically if it's only a single type that I have such an issue, I can basically get down to normal, or then I pay indeed the difference. And this triggers for a lot of companies the issue of license management. Because when you are, I don't know, Novartis, and you have, I don't know how many Microsoft licenses, to make sure that everyone is comply with the metrics, it's difficult. And a lot of companies, they expect from the vendor actually to put in place a way to manage the licenses. And the service provider, obviously, they tend to say, yeah, but that's not my problem, it's your problem. So it triggers some discussion as well. The support, as I mentioned, it's required to maintain the software and to benefit from update and upgrades. Typically, the price of the maintenance is between 17 to 20% of the yearly license fee. That's kind of the standard in the industry. And then you may say, okay, but what's the point of granting a warranty upon a software if in any case you benefit from the support? Which is quite true. In the end, usually the client, they prefer to have the support. They are not so keen on the warranty in the end. But you may say, though, that warranty, you certainly do not benefit from updates or upgrades, but you should remedy any bug and defects for free. And therefore, you may say, well, for the first year, or as long as the warranty is running, I should pay less for my support because I only need the support potentially for updates, upgrades, which normally you should not have during the duration of the warranty. But it's hardly negotiated. An issue which is trickier for big companies is the question to know whether updates or upgrades are mandatory. Because when you want to roll out an update or an upgrade on a worldwide basis, it can take up to 6 months. And if it's software on site. And of course, at a group level, it is an issue. And so they tend to say, okay, we want you to have a minimum number of releases per year, but also a maximum. A minimum because we want to make sure that you are doing product improvement, but a maximum because we do not want you to, we do not want to have to make 5 or 6 rollouts per year. It's too much for us, and we cannot do that. And then the question is, what's the impact of the absence of an update on the support you can benefit as a client? Because some companies, they will say, if you don't have the latest version, sorry, but we are not going to support you. So as a client, you try to have the latest version -2, usually released, and make sure that you are covered on that regard. But again, it's a matter of bargaining power. Rebundling is also something that one needs to make attention as a client, because sometimes, I mean, when you have new release version, you may want to either remove certain feature or rebundle them with another software package, and the client may be unhappy with that because they may say, yeah, but hey guys, I mean, we contracted with you because we are interested in certain number of features, and now you are telling us because of an upgrade that I don't have that feature anymore, and I don't want that. And so you want to make sure contractually that you list the feature that should not be removed, or that you should benefit then from the update or upgrade where that feature has been incorporated. So rebundling is sometimes can be a tricky issue as a client. Data and security, by data I mean personal data. It's less important, obviously, when it's an on-site software than in the cloud. The questions around are mostly around the support. Okay, I mean, the provider may access potentially personal data through the support, so I still need to be a little bit cautious about that. But obviously, it's less critical than in the cloud. So you have an annex if it is deemed appropriate on that regard. That's for the license. For the cloud, so I don't need for you to obviously define what it is. There is no acceptance process because obviously you are immediately with a tool that is available, although a POC, a proof of concept, is possible. Interest, you know, this is more for lawyers who are not always familiar. Obviously, additional requirements in terms of security, that's for sure. Unlike the situation with an on-site software, you clearly benefit from the support, which is included in the fee you pay. Normally, I should say, because yeah, at our firm, actually, we have a cloud-based service where they charge us for the maintenance, and I told my partners, yeah, but that's not normal, guys. But well, normally that should be included in the fee that you pay, and obviously that's one of the main advantages of the cloud as well as for a company, is that you benefit automatically from update, upgrade, etc., which are pushed in the fee. The license, yeah. So there are two types of license in a cloud-based agreement. There is a license that you, as the provider, you will grant in favor of your clients to access and use the service, basically. But on the other hand, there is also a license granted by the client to enable you as a provider to upload and host the data. And so there is a reciprocal license on that regard. So the user license, okay, so it's a little bit the same as for the on-prem license, no exclusivity, etc. So the territory, unlike the situation with an on-prem license, it's typically worldwide because it's cloud-based, so there is no reason to limit that per territory. The duration, it's never perpetual. It's always a subscription model because that's the business model, obviously. And yeah, I mean, there may be use restriction, but it's less common, at least in my experience, than for on-prem software. Then the customer grants the provider a license for the data that are hosted on the platform, only to the extent required to perform the agreement, to do some troubleshooting, to etc. So to basically make sure that the service is provided as it should. The support usually takes the form of an annex called an SLA, or service level agreement. You're probably, I guess, familiar with that, which will typically include different type of provisions, such as how do you communicate your issues? Do you have a ticketing system? If you have a P1, so a critical issue, will it be through, will you have a phone to access the person? Then the key, obviously, it's the availability and average response time. So the availability, it's typically a 99.9 nearly now. The question being, how do you define that? Because if you do 99.9 per month or per quarter, it's not the same. And usually it's more per quarter. The average response time, so the time loaded to run a transaction or a page, usually the providers are quite reluctant to grant an average response time because they will say, yeah, but I mean, there are some latency I'm not responsible for, and I do not control all the factors coming into play. And so you need to define clearly from which point to which point you want to actually measure your average response time. And so there are some questions around this because, which is fair enough. Response, resolution time, follow-up. So response time, it's quite easy. Usually people, I mean, we find a way to agree. The resolution time, it's obviously much harder because as a provider, you will say, yeah, but even if it's a P1, I have no clue until I run a root cause analysis what the problem is. And until I know that, I cannot tell you how long that will take for me to remedy the problem. And as a client, if you have a P1 issue, of course you want to say, yeah, but I need some idea because I need, if all my production chain is down because I have a P1 issue, you cannot just tell me, yeah, I don't know and I can remedy that. So there are some tough questions. Usually you discuss about temporary workaround, etc. And obviously you also address the follow-up. So you want to make sure that people are working on that. And if you are a big service provider, you have a rule called follow the sun rule, where basically you say, okay, when we are going to bed, it's the East Coast that take the lead, then it's the West Coast, then it's Asia Pacific, etc., etc. That's for big players who can afford. Then you have priority levels that you will define. If it's a P1, it's a critical issue. If it's a P2, it's maybe only one market, but still critical. If it's a P3, etc., etc. So you can go down up to P5 usually, but then the definition depends upon the contract. To have an SLA is nice, but if you have no sanction, if you do not comply as a provider for the client, it does not really make sense. So to create an incentive to make sure that the provider comply, you will put in place a service credit to say, okay, if you fail to comply with your availability rate, for instance, then you owe me 10% of the fee that I can discount or that I can set off on a future invoice, for instance. And that's a discussion. So to be honest, usually the clients, they do not really care about the service credit, but they want to put them in place to make sure that you have an incentive to comply and to say, we won't let it go if there is an issue. Termination event, if things really go wrong and that basically you are, the provider is not reliable, you cannot trust him, then you say at some point, okay, I mean, it's a material breach and we need to stop because it cannot go on that way. Yeah, so again, customers may take a close look. It's a bit like the rebundling. It's the removal of functionalities as a result of updates or upgrades of your service. And also a change of the level of support. This can happen, and this is put under scrutiny, obviously, by the client. The data and the security, it's much more important, obviously, than an on-site license, especially with regard to the GDPR, so this General Data Protection Regulation that you probably have heard about. So I'm not going to go into the detail because that's a whole topic as such. But obviously what is key is that at least all the data are segregated. And as a client at least, especially if it's cloud-based, because it creates some lock-in effects for the client, you want to negotiate as well as can be the exit at the handover period. If there is a migration of data, that should, in my view, be anticipated. Even though when you conclude an agreement, you are not very much willing to think already about the end if things go wrong. But as a client, you need to make sure, because I mean, the migration of data can cost hundreds of thousands, if not more, of francs. And obviously, when you say to a provider, we are leaving you guys, we are going to another one, they are not really willing to help. So it's still better to make sure that you have an exit strategy before signing the contract. Obviously, data return / destruction, deletion, etc., making them inaccessible within a certain time, typically 30 days after the termination. You also discuss the format because it needs to be readable, obviously, and as easy to use as can be for the client. And then you will have typically also discussion around the backup and the DRP. So disaster recovery plan. How long may I lose my data if there is an issue, etc., etc. These are obviously in fairly big agreements. So they are for both the license and the cloud. Just a couple of words for the professional services. So typically, it can be some development agreement for a product, and there it can relate either to a product that you develop from scratch or to customization of a standard product. So what's the process? Well, typically you will have the frame, and you will have below a statement of work that will define all the milestones, the timing where the milestone need to be achieved, the deliverables, the deadline, etc., etc. More and more, we can see that Agile is used, typically Scrum, in this type of project. So you have sprints, which in the end, honestly, are just shortened acceptance phases, usually by 2 weeks or else. And that's in the statement, typically addressed in the statement of work. So if you develop a new product, obviously the client will to make sure that you own the rights of the development, so that they don't face suddenly an issue of a third party coming to them and say, yeah, but hey guys, you are infringing my rights on the product. So they want to make sure that you grant them a warranty that you did not infringe any third party rights, and that it's really your development, or that you got the license required in that case. And if there is a breach, you would need to indemnify for the prejudice suffered by the client. So the rights, typically upon the developments, normally since the client is paying, he may want to have the rights. However, maybe that one, because since we are talking about OSS, at least make a reference on that regard. So the client actually, they are quite easy to address OSS in a developed product. They will say, okay, if you use OSS module, what we expect from you is that if we use our product in accordance with the term of the license, then we are not supposed to infringe whatever OSS license terms are applicable. It's your duty to make sure that if you build your product using OSS, then when you use your product, we will not breach those terms. Obviously, as a provider, sometimes you want to try and say, here are basically the OSS we are using. Please check that you are fine with the license terms. And then it's a bargaining, again, power. If you have a big client, he will say, hey guys, we are not going to review your 50 license. We ask you something, we just make sure that we are compliant. And then if you are obviously smaller, you may have to do that. So as a client, you actually also have to wonder, does it make sense to really own the rights on the product? Because sometimes, in any case, I'm not going to to really be able to further develop it or to do something because I don't have the skills for that. And maybe it's better if I let the provider actually include the product in instead on list so that I can benefit from the updates, upgrades, improvement, and the support that goes with it. And it's also a way actually for a provider to sell basically and say, I want to own the rights, because if I own the rights, I will benefit from the feedback from my other customers, I can improve the product, and maybe you can benefit from the support, from the update, etc. If I have to assign all my rights to you, I have no incentive then to help you out or improve, etc. And so for the client, in the end, the key question is, does the product that you are developing for me really provide me with a competitive advantage? That makes it worse for me to really own the rights and make sure that you are not going to sub-license your product to someone else. But if it's not the case, you may be better at with the support and upgrade, etc., etc. So if it's a customization, that is to say that the client is using your standard product, but he says, yeah, but you know what? Me with our company, we would be very much interested if you could develop for us that feature on your product. And you may say yes. But then it's really difficult to say, okay, who owns the right upon that specific development? Because it hardly makes sense to own the rights upon the development if you have no rights upon the standard product that needs to be used with it. So you have a lot of agreement that try to make a distinction between what is called foreground IP or background IP, that is to say the IP that existed before the development, and then the one resulting from the customization. But honestly, it does not really help much. In the end, what the client really wants to make sure is that it's not blocked. He wants to make sure that business continuity is assured and that he will not have issue if suddenly the license is stopping. So the default in this type of agreement is that the IP are held by the supplier, but the client enjoys a license as broad as can be, potentially even exclusive, maybe, upon the work product, that is to say the development that you've made for them. The problem is that, of course, the license upon the standard product is not perpetual. So I would say, in the end, you can always try and negotiate joint ownership, but honestly, that's a nightmare because nobody really agrees, and it can trigger a lot of issues. What is strongly recommended, actually, is to avoid as much as can be customization and deviation from standard products. And now, there's a clear trend within companies to try and use off-the-shelf product as much as can be, because also from a cost standpoint for them, it's much more efficient, actually, and they benefit from the improvement. Final words, just to mention digital. So I was saying it's basically a development service, but that relates to web or mobile application. And there, what is specific is that you will ask a digital agency, typically, to access content, because you need pictures, you need maybe videos, you need a lot of copyrighted content, actually, to do your mobile or web app. Or even brand. And there, of course, I would say for the specific provision, as an agency, you do not want to warrant the absence of breach of a third-party brand if you look for one, or you cannot ensure the client that you will always have an assignment of the rights on a picture, on the content, etc., belonging to a third party. So what you want is to make sure that at least you get the broadest license you can, and that if there are any restriction, typically in terms of duration or else, you are aware of them, so that you can address that in due course. Okay, I think I'm running out of time, so I will stop there. I had a couple of words on GDPR, but we can discuss that later on, and I don't want to hold you back from the apéro. Thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions, feel free. I will also be around for a couple of minutes. So,
des questions? Bon, on a un apéritif, si jamais les personnes qui ont fait des présentations elles sont encore là. Elles m'ont dit qu'elles restaient, c'est juste tout le monde. Ouais. Pas de questions? Donc, on passe à la dernière étape. Roland. Mais avant ça, je vais vous remercier.